The gun was already pressed against Calvin Merritt's chest when Rebecca Morgan stepped out of the shadows and said the words that changed everything. "He didn't steal your cattle, Mr. Hargrove. I saw who did. And if you pull that trigger, the only person who can prove Calvin's innocence dies with him." Every man in the dusty square of Cimarron, New Mexico, turned to look at her. Every single one. And Rebecca felt it like a brand seared across her skin. That weight of collective attention she had spent 4 years running from. 4 years perfecting the art of disappearing. 4 years learning how to fold herself so small that nobody could see her well enough to remember her face when the men who were hunting her came asking questions. But Calvin Merritt was going to die if she stayed invisible. She had watched them drag him out of the Silver Horn Saloon 10 minutes ago. She had watched from behind the curtain of her rented room above the dry goods store, her fingers pressed flat against the dusty glass, her heart hammering the way it always did when she recognized the particular geometry of injustice. She had told herself what she always told herself. Not your town, not your fight. You keep moving. You keep your head down. You survive. She had told herself that right up until the moment Hargrove pressed the barrel against Calvin's ribs, and she saw Calvin's face, calm and steady, and utterly unafraid in a way that broke something open inside her chest, something she had kept locked for a very long time. She had told herself that, and then she had walked straight down the stairs and out into the blazing September afternoon of 1882 and spoken the words that made every man in Cimarron look at her. Now the moment hung suspended, brittle as glass. Hargrove, a thick-necked cattle baron with a face like weathered sandstone, turned his small eyes on her. "Who in the devil are you?" "My name is Rebecca Morgan," she said, and the words cost her more than anyone in that square could have understood. "And 3 nights ago, before sundown, I was on the Cimarron River Trail when I saw 4 riders pushing a herd of about 40 cattle northeast, not toward Merritt land. Away from it." The square was absolutely silent except for the wind moving through it. She watched Calvin Merritt's dark eyes find her across the distance. She had seen him before only in passing. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that formed the mesas outside town. He had tipped his hat to her twice in 5 days, and both times she had looked away immediately, the way she always looked away from men who noticed her. He was looking at her now, and she could not look away. "You can verify it," she said, keeping her voice level, keeping it professional, keeping it exactly the way her father had taught her to testify when she was a little girl watching him argue cases in a Missouri courtroom. "Send men to the Northeast Trail. You will find evidence. Tracks, dropped rope, cattle signs. Whatever it is you need." Hargrove's grip on his gun did not loosen. "A woman I never seen before rides into my dispute and expects me to believe her word over 20 years of knowing Calvin Merritt's greedy. I am not asking you to believe my word," Rebecca said. "I am asking you to delay pulling that trigger long enough to check the trail. If I am wrong, you lose nothing. If you are wrong, you murder an innocent man and live with that until the day you die." Another silence. Longer this time. She could feel the sweat gathering along her spine despite the relative coolness she was projecting on the outside. She had gotten very good at projecting coolness. Hargrove finally lowered the gun. The crowd exhaled. Calvin Merritt was released, and the riders Hargrove sent out returned within the hour with exactly the evidence Rebecca had described. The cattle had been moved by 2 of Hargrove's own ranch hands, who had sold the herd to a buyer in Clayton, and planned to blame the neighboring rancher. Hargrove, to his credit, apologized to Calvin with a handshake that looked genuinely painful for him to offer. By the time the whole business was resolved, the sun was angling low and orange over the mesa tops, and Rebecca was already back in her room, already pulling her single traveling trunk from under the bed, already calculating whether she could catch the morning stage to Raton or whether she needed to leave tonight. She had just made herself visible in a way she absolutely could not afford. The knock at her door came 20 minutes later. She stood very still on the other side of it, trunk half packed, heart doing something complicated and unwelcome. "Miss Morgan," said the voice on the other side. Low, steady. The voice of a man who was used to the outdoors, used to open spaces, used to speaking to be heard over wind. "My name is Calvin Merritt. I believe I owe you a significant debt, and I would consider it an honor if you would allow me to say so to your face." She pressed her palm flat against the door as though she could feel him through the wood. She should not open it. She opened it. He was taller than she had registered from across the square. His hat was in his hands, turning slowly by the brim, and his eyes up close were the deep particular brown of river water in autumn, with something behind them that was quiet and careful and very, very attentive. "Thank you," he said simply. She had expected something more elaborate. She had expected the kind of gratitude that came with strings and expectations and the slow, suffocating weight of obligation. She had experienced that kind of gratitude before, and it had cost her terribly. "You're welcome," she said. "Can I ask why?" He was not stepping forward, not pressing, not filling the doorway with assumption. He was standing at a careful, respectful distance with his hat in his hands like a question mark made out of a man. "Why what? Why you stepped in? You don't know me. You've been in town 5 days, and I don't think I've heard you say more than 6 words to anyone." She felt something cold move through her. He had been watching her, not in the hungry, cataloging way that made her skin crawl. In the thoughtful, observant way that meant he was the kind of person who paid attention to the world around him. That was, in some ways, more dangerous. Hargrove was about to kill an innocent man, she said. "That happens in New Mexico territory fairly regularly," Calvin said, and there was a dry humor in it that surprised her into something close to a smile. "People don't usually put themselves in the path of it for a stranger." "I am passing through," she said, and the words were meant to be a closing statement, a door shut politely in his face. "I will be gone by morning." Something shifted in his expression, something careful and deliberate. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "North," she said, which was true in the way that all her answers were true, directionally accurate and empty of detail. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the unsettling sensation that he was reading something in her face that she had not intended to write there. "All right," he said. He settled his hat back on his head, and the motion had the particular unhurried dignity of a man who knew his own worth without needing to perform it. "I hope the road is kind to you, Miss Morgan. I mean that sincerely." He turned and walked down the narrow corridor toward the stairs, and Rebecca Morgan stood in her doorway and watched him go and felt something in her chest clench like a fist around something fragile. She closed the door. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She did not finish packing the trunk. She needed to go back to the beginning, to understand how she had arrived in Cimarron, New Mexico in September of 1882 with a half-packed trunk, and a name she had almost forgotten was her real one. She had been born Rebecca Ann Morgan in St. Joseph, Missouri, in 1858, to a lawyer father and a schoolteacher mother who had given her, between them, an education that most women of her era would never access. She had read law books at 14. She had argued constitutional principles with her father's colleagues at 16. At 19, she had married a man named Franklin Doss, who was handsome and charming and who turned out to be something else entirely beneath that charm. A man with a shadow economy of fraud and theft and connections to men whose names made Missouri judges go pale. The marriage had lasted 2 years. Getting out of it had cost her everything. Her father's practice had been threatened. Her mother had been frightened out of her own home for 3 weeks. And the men Franklin Doss owed money to had decided that Rebecca, who had seen too much and knew too many names, was a loose end that needed permanent resolution. She had run in 1880. She had been running since. Not west with hope, the way the newspapers liked to paint it. West with fear, which was a different kind of running entirely. Dodge City, Kansas had been her first stop. She had taken a job as a seamstress, worked quietly for 8 months. Then a man with a Missouri accent had started asking around the boarding house about a young, dark-haired woman traveling alone, and she had left on the next available transport. Trinidad, Colorado had lasted 5 months before she recognized one of Franklin's associates in the mercantile and vanished by midnight. Las Vegas, New Mexico had been 7 months. She had started to breathe there, started to feel the particular luxury of a town that had so much going on that no single woman could be particularly noticed. And then she had made the mistake of helping a woman in the street who was being followed by a threatening man, and her face had been in the Las Vegas Optic the next morning under the headline "Local Woman Shows Remarkable Courage," and she had fled the same afternoon. That was the pattern, the cruel, relentless pattern. Every time she did something visible, every time she let herself be herself, the world noticed. And when the world noticed, the men who wanted to find her had a trail to follow, so she had become invisible. It was an art form and she had mastered it. She wore plain clothes, dusty browns and faded grays. She kept her hair pinned tight and covered under a bonnet as much as possible. She took rooms at the back of boarding houses, paid in cash, offered surnames but rarely first names, and she never intervened in the affairs of others no matter what she witnessed. Until Calvin Merritt. She sat on the edge of the bed in Cimarron and pressed her hands together between her knees and tried to understand what had happened to her discipline. She had watched him stand there with a gun at his chest, and something had simply refused to be contained. Something in her that was older than the running, something that remembered the person she had been before Franklin Doss and the terror and the long gray years of self-erasure. She had been someone once, someone with opinions and courage and a sense of what was right, someone who would have stepped into that square without a second thought. She had missed being that person so desperately that she had apparently lost her mind for 60 seconds and stepped into it again. And now Calvin Merritt had knocked on her door with his hat in his hands and looked at her like she was something worth looking at, and she needed to leave Cimarron before she did something else that would get her killed. She lay back on the bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling, and sleep came for her eventually, carrying with it dreams of Missouri courtrooms and a gun pressed against a man's chest and a pair of autumn brown eyes that refused to look away. She was still in Cimarron the next morning. She told herself it was because the morning stage to Raton had already departed and the next one was not until Friday, which was 3 days away. This was factually true. She chose not to examine whether she had taken any steps to find an alternative route. She went to the only restaurant in Cimarron, a low adobe building called Delgado's that served eggs and coffee and fresh bread that smelled like salvation, and she sat at a table by the wall with her back to the room the way she always positioned herself, able to see the door, able to assess threats, unable to be approached from behind. Calvin Merritt came in 20 minutes later. He scanned the room the way a rancher scanned a pasture, efficiently and without drama, and when his eyes found her he paused for just a moment. She looked down at her coffee cup. When she looked up again, he was asking Maria Delgado something, gesturing toward Rebecca's table with a respectful, inquiring tilt of his head, and Maria was nodding and smiling in the particular warm, conspiratorial way of women who like to see people connect. He crossed the room and stopped a respectful distance from her table. "The place is filling up," he said. "Maria says this is the only open table. I'll find somewhere else if you prefer your privacy." He was giving her an exit. A clean, unforced exit. She recognized it as a form of courtesy so rare in her experience that it landed somewhere near her sternum with an almost physical impact. "Sit down," she said. He sat, setting his hat on the chair beside him, and ordered coffee and eggs from a passing girl with a quiet thank you that the girl clearly appreciated because she smiled at him properly, not the rote professional smile but the genuine one. He was a man people liked. She could see it in the way Maria Delgado had looked at him, in the way the girl smiled. It was not the false magnetism of a man like Franklin Doss, all surface charm designed to disarm and manipulate. It was the quieter, harder-earned thing of a man who had simply behaved decently to people over many years and accumulated the goodwill of it. She needed to be careful around that. It was seductive in a way she had not anticipated. "You're still here," he said. "Stage doesn't run until Friday," she said. He nodded. No comment on whether he was glad about it, no performance of casual disinterest. Just a nod as if the information simply settled into him and he was comfortable letting it. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, and it was clearly meant as light conversation, not interrogation, but it hit the familiar tripwire in her chest regardless. "East," she said. He looked at her steadily over the rim of his coffee cup, not pressing, not retreating either. "You are a careful woman," he said after a moment. "I find it useful," she said. "I imagine you do." He looked out the window at the early morning street. A freight wagon was rolling past, loaded with lumber. Two dogs argued briefly over something in the dust and then went their separate ways. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable last night, coming to your door." "You didn't," she said, and found that it was true. "You came to say something and then you left. That was appropriate." "Good." He seemed genuinely relieved, which surprised her. They ate in a silence that should have been awkward and somehow was not. She was not accustomed to silences with men that did not carry some undercurrent of agenda. This one felt simple and undemanding, like the silence of sitting near a well-behaved fire. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, and was mildly surprised at herself for saying it. He looked at her, and she thought she saw something warm move across his face quickly, not triumph, more like gratitude for the invitation. He was a man who loved his subject. "The Merritt place has been in my family since my father came out here in 1859, he said. "He came from Tennessee. He built the original structure himself, him and two hired men and a mule named Patterson who apparently worked harder than both men combined." A small, dry smile. "I grew up there. I've expanded it some. About 600 acres now along the Cimarron River. Good grass, good water. I run about 300 cattle and 30 horses." "It sounds like home," she said, and the word came out with a longing she had not intended to express. He heard it. She could tell by the way he went quiet for a moment, thoughtful. "It is home," he said. "I know not everyone has that." She looked at her coffee. "No," she said, "not everyone does." The breakfast ended, and they walked out into the September morning together, which had not been precisely planned, but had simply happened the way things happen when two people finish a meal at the same time, and the door is the only logical direction. They stood on the wooden boardwalk outside Delgado's in the bright early light, and the town moved around them. "I have business at the land office," Calvin said. He paused. Then, with the careful, unhurried approach of a man who understood that an invitation required a willingness to be refused without resentment, "If you find yourself with nothing urgent to occupy your morning, I would be glad of the company afterward. I could show you something of the town." She should have said no. "All right," she said. He did not smile like he had won something. He just nodded, like the world had arranged itself reasonably, and went to his business. She walked the length of Cimarron's main street 3 times while she waited, studying it the way she always studied towns, cataloging exits and dangers, and the social topography of a place. Cimarron in 1882 was a town in transition, no longer quite the wild, lawless place it had been in the early 1870s when the Colfax County War had turned it into a battleground of land disputes and hired violence, but not yet fully tamed either. The land-grant troubles that had consumed northern New Mexico for decades had left the community with a layer of bone-deep wariness under its everyday surface. People here knew what it was to have your claim disputed by powerful men. People here knew about injustice. She found, unexpectedly, that she liked the town for that. There was a quality of resilience in its dust. Calvin found her outside the hotel at 10 o'clock, and they walked the town together in the warm September sunshine, and he showed it to her the way a person shows something beloved, with a pride that included its flaws. He pointed out the old St. James Hotel, where he said more men had been shot in the past decade than most people cared to count, and the new schoolhouse that the community had built with collected funds 3 years ago, and the acequia that ran along the edge of the residential quarter carrying water from the mountains. He introduced her to 3 people they encountered, and each time he said simply, "This is Rebecca Morgan," which struck her because most men, when introducing a woman they had just met, felt the need to add context. He was my father's friend's daughter, or she is visiting from Kansas. Calvin said her name as though it were sufficient information, as though she were sufficient, and required no further framing. She was in serious danger of liking this man very much. She needed to address this carefully. "You never married?" she asked, which was forward, she knew, but she had found that direct questions were sometimes the most efficient defense. If he was spoken for, the warmth she felt spending time with him could be redirected into simple platonic gratitude, and she could stop this before it became anything more complicated. "No," he said. He did not seem offended by the question, just honest with it. "I came close once. A woman named Clara Bates who moved to Santa Fe with her family when I was 26. We wrote letters for a while after. It faded." A pause. "It was not the right thing for either of us, I think. We were kind to each other in choosing a graceful end." "That is more civilized than most endings," she said. "What about you?" he asked, and then immediately, quietly, "You don't have to answer that." She looked at the acequia and watched the water move. "I was married," she said. "It was not a good marriage. It ended." She paused. "That is as much as I can say." "That is enough," he said simply. No questions. No curiosity dressed as concern. No probing at the edges of what she had offered to find the shape of what she was hiding. She was beginning to understand that Calvin Merritt was a specific and rare kind of man, and the understanding was making the 3 days, until the Friday stage feel, simultaneously, very short and alarmingly long. That evening she went back to her room and wrote a letter to no one in particular, the way she sometimes did when she needed to process something, a letter that would never be sent. She wrote about a town in New Mexico and a man with autumn-brown eyes who had looked at her like she was sufficient. She folded the letter and tucked it under her mattress and lay in the dark for a long time. She did not want to run. That was the thing that was different about Cimarron. Every other time, the running had been frightening, but she had wanted it, or at least had wanted the safety it represented. She had wanted to disappear because disappearing meant surviving. The self she was erasing had been a self she could grieve later when she was somewhere safer, and later had never quite arrived, but the theory had sustained her. This time, for the first time in 2 years, she was aware of wanting something other than survival. She was aware of wanting to stay. She pressed that wanting down as firmly as she could and went asleep. Wednesday came and went. She spent it at the back of the dry goods store helping the owner, a patient elderly woman named Mrs. Pacheco, organize new stock that had arrived by freight. It was the kind of work she often found in towns when she needed to occupy her hands, and she was good at it, efficient and thorough, and Mrs. Pacheco paid her a small wage and offered to extend the arrangement if she intended to remain in Cimarron longer than her stage departure. "I am leaving Friday," Rebecca said. Mrs. Pacheco looked at her with the wise and slightly impatient expression of a woman who had watched many young people make decisions they would regret. "Well," she said. Thursday morning, Calvin came to find her. He appeared in the doorway of the dry goods store at 9 o'clock with an expression that was calibrated carefully between casual and deliberate. He was holding his hat. "Good morning," he said to Mrs. Pacheco, who beamed at him with spectacular transparency, and then to Rebecca, "I was wondering if I might borrow you for a few hours. There's something I'd like to show you." Mrs. Pacheco made an expansive gesture of permission that Rebecca had not asked for. Rebecca considered briefly the logic of refusal. She identified no compelling logical grounds that were not, at their root, simply fear. And she had been operating out of fear for 2 years, and she was very tired of it. "All right," she said. He had 2 horses, a dark bay mare that he introduced as Cora, and a quieter gray gelding with a gentle mouth that he said was named Sunday. He helped her mount with a steadying hand at her elbow that was there and then gone, no lingering, no excusing the contact. They rode south out of Cimarron into the wide Morno Valley, where the autumn grass was turning amber, and the Cimarron Range rose to the west in long, blue-gray ridges, and the sky overhead was the violent, unsentimental blue of New Mexico in September. It was the kind of landscape that made small human concerns feel appropriately sized, which Rebecca needed. He talked a little as they rode, about the history of the valley, about the Maxwell land grant disputes that had forced so many settlers off claimed land over the past decade, about the ways the territory was changing as the Santa Fe Ring lost some of its stranglehold on Colfax County politics. He talked about these things with the informed frustration of a man who had been directly affected, whose family had spent years in legal uncertainty about the ground beneath their feet, and she listened and asked occasional questions, and felt the old intellectual part of herself, the part that had read her father's law books at 14, reaching toward the conversation with something like pleasure. He had not brought her out here to impress her, she realized. He had brought her out here because this was the thing he knew best, this land and its complicated human history, and he wanted to share it with her the way a person shares something true. They stopped on a rise above a creek bend where a stand of cottonwoods was going yellow, their leaves trembling in the mild wind, and Calvin said, "My father planted 3 of those when he first came here. He said they'd tell him when summer was ending, every year." She looked at the trees and felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite longing but contained elements of both. "He sounds like he was a man who thought in generations," she said. He was. Calvin was quiet for a moment, and she could see him with his father in those years, a boy learning the shape of a life from a man who believed in permanence. He died in 1875. He would have liked this year's grass. She sat on Sunday the gray gelding in the amber afternoon and looked at the cottonwoods his father had planted and thought about permanence, about what it meant to be so rooted in a place that you named the trees, that you imagined the future of the land in seasons, that you thought about what the grass would do the year after you were gone. She had lived in temporary rooms for 2 years. She had not unpacked a trunk properly in 2 years. She carried her most important possessions in a leather satchel that could be grabbed in 60 seconds. She was unutterably tired of it. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her own voice surprised her with its quiet resolution, as though some decision had been made below the level of conscious thought, and she was only now learning about it. He turned to look at her with full attention, the same quality of attention he had been giving her since the beginning, that steady, unhurried thing that asked nothing while somehow receiving everything. "I am not traveling north by preference," she said. "I am running from something. I have been running for 2 years. I don't use my full name in most places. I try very hard not to be remembered." She paused. "You should know this before you spend any more of your time on my company." He looked at her steadily. "Are you in danger? There are men looking for me. My former husband had associates who believe I am a threat to them." She had never said this to anyone before, not this plainly. It felt like setting down a stone she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten she was carrying it. "They have not found me because I have been careful. When I spoke up in the square on Monday, I broke my own most important rule." "Because you couldn't let an innocent man be shot," he said. "Apparently not." He was quiet for a long time. The cottonwood leaves moved in the wind. A hawk turned in a slow spiral above the creek. "These men," he said finally. "What are they after? Information you have, retaliation?" "Both. My former husband, Franklin Doss, ran fraudulent land and mining claims in Missouri and Kansas. I was married to him for 2 years. I saw documents. I heard conversations. I know names. The men he owed money to, the men who financed his schemes. Some of them are influential people. People who would suffer significantly if I were ever to testify before a court or speak to a federal marshal." Calvin absorbed this. She could see him working through it, not with the dramatic alarm she might have expected, but with the same practical, methodical attention he probably applied to everything. "Have you spoken to a federal marshal?" "I don't know who I can trust," she said. "The reach of these men extended into law enforcement in Missouri. I don't know how far it extends elsewhere." "Do you know the names of all the people involved?" "Yes." He looked at her. Something in his expression had settled into a kind of decision that she recognized as significant without yet knowing what it contained. "You could testify," he said, "if you found the right federal authority, U.S. Marshals out here operate largely independently of Missouri patronage. Judge Isaac Parker's district out of Fort Smith has a reputation for pursuing federal cases without political interference." She stared at him. "You know about federal jurisprudence." "My father was in a land dispute for 11 years, Calvin said simply. "I know more about territorial and federal law than most ranchers, I expect." She felt something she had not felt in 2 years, the particular relief of being in the presence of someone who met her where she actually was rather than where he expected a woman to be. "I have thought about testifying," she said carefully. "But I have been afraid to stop moving long enough to pursue it." "What would you need to feel safe enough to stop?" he asked. The question undid her slightly, not because it was presumptuous, because it was precisely the right question, the one nobody had thought to ask, the one she had never heard directed at her by anyone in all the months of running. She looked at the cottonwood trees. "I don't know," she admitted. A place that felt secure, time to think, someone who understood what was actually at stake. Calvin turned his horse back toward the trail in the direction of Cimarron. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just in the practical way of a man who had identified a next step and was taking it. "Stay," he said simply. "Stay in Cimarron for a while. I can provide a place on the ranch property that would give you privacy and security. I know most of the men in this county and I know who can be trusted. We can figure out the rest." She should have argued. She should have pointed out the risks, the exposure, the fact that she had just told him her secrets and he was a stranger, and she had learned in the worst possible way what happened when you trusted the wrong man. But she looked at Calvin Merritt on his dark bay mare in the amber autumn light with the mountains behind him and the sky above him and his father's cottonwood trees turning yellow down by the water, and she understood that the terror of staying was, this once, smaller than the cost of leaving. "All right," she said for the third time in 3 days. She did not catch the Friday stage. The arrangement Calvin proposed was practical and unambiguous. There was a small foreman's cabin on the eastern edge of the Merritt property, unused since the previous foreman had married and relocated to Taos 2 years ago. It was a solid, well-built structure, one room with a sleeping loft, a good stone fireplace, a stove, and its own water access from a diverted creek channel. Rebecca could have it indefinitely, with complete privacy, and Calvin would make it known to his ranch hands that she was a guest of the family and not to be discussed with outsiders. She moved in on Saturday morning. Mrs. Pacheco sent her off with a jar of preserved peaches and the knowing look of a woman who had been right all along. The cabin was quiet and solid and smelled of cedar and old wood smoke. Rebecca stood in the middle of it with her trunk at her feet and breathed in the smell of something she had not had in 2 years. Safety, provisional and constructed and fragile in ways she was fully aware of, but safety nonetheless. She unpacked the trunk completely for the first time in 2 years. She hung her 2 dresses on the pegs beside the door. She set her books on the windowsill. She put her mother's small silver-backed hairbrush on the shelf above the washstand where she could see it. She arranged these objects in the space with a deliberateness that felt almost ceremonial, as though she were making a declaration to the room itself. "I intend to be here long enough for this to matter." Calvin came by that afternoon with 2 of his ranch hands carrying a load of additional firewood and a cast iron pot that he said the kitchen had a spare of, and he stayed just long enough to make sure the stove was drawing properly and the water channel was running clear. He was helpful without being intrusive, present without being overwhelming. When he left, she stood in the doorway and watched the 3 of them ride back toward the main ranch house and felt, with a clarity that startled her, that she was watching something she wanted to be a permanent part of her view. This was a problem, or it was an opportunity. She had not yet determined which. The first week passed in a routine that began to feel like something she could inhabit. She continued her work at Mrs. Pacheco's dry goods store in town 3 days a week, which gave her income and structure and a connection to Cimarron's social fabric. She spent the other days at the cabin, reading and thinking and beginning, very slowly, to write down what she knew about Franklin Doss and his associates in the organized, logical format her father had taught her for legal documentation. It was a grim exercise but a clarifying one. She had been running from the knowledge she carried as though it were a burden. Writing it down made it feel more like a weapon. Calvin came by most evenings. Not every evening, not with any appearance of obligation. He came with what seemed like genuine desire for her company, and always left at a reasonable hour after conversations that ranged from territorial law to Tennessee history to the best methods for preserving root vegetables through a New Mexico winter. He had a reading habit she respected, and they began loaning each other books, which meant he came by sometimes simply to return one and stayed to discuss it. He was becoming her friend. It was the most natural thing that had happened to her in years, and also the most dangerous, because she was aware that it was not entirely staying within the boundaries of friendship for either of them, and she did not quite know what to do about that. 3 weeks into her residence on the Merritt property, on a Sunday afternoon in early October when the aspens on the higher slopes had gone fully gold, she was sitting outside the cabin on the small bench Calvin had placed there, her legal notes in her lap, the late afternoon sun warm on her face, when one of the ranch hands, a young man named Torres who had always been respectful and quiet, came riding in at a pace that was not quite an emergency gallop but was considerably faster than casual. He pulled up near the cabin and said, "Miss Morgan, there's a man in town at the Cimarron Hotel asking after a woman matching your description. Says he's from Missouri. Mr. Merritt said to come tell you directly." She was on her feet before Torres had finished the sentence. The cold was back in her chest, the old familiar cold. "What did he look like?" she asked. Torres described him. Medium height, gray suit, a face like a man who spent a lot of time sitting at desks. A man who would look unremarkable on any street in any city, which was precisely the kind of man Franklin Doss employed to do the things he did not want attributed to him. "Where is Calvin?" she said. "At the hotel now," Torres said. "He went himself when he heard." She was already moving toward the small pasture where Sunday the gray gelding was grazing. She did not fully stop to consider what it meant that her first thought was to go to Calvin. The thought was simply there, complete and instinctive, and she acted on it. By the time she reached the Cimarron Hotel, leading her horse at a quick walk rather than drawing attention with a full canter, Calvin was standing on the boardwalk outside with his arms crossed and an expression of composed, watchful attention. He saw her coming, and the relief that crossed his face was brief but unmistakable. "He's gone," Calvin said when she reached him. "Checked out an hour after he checked in. I spoke to him." Her heart was hammering. "What did you say?" "I told him I didn't know any woman matching his description and that if he was looking for someone in Colfax County he should speak with the county sheriff." He paused. "He didn't like that much." "Did he believe you?" "I don't know." Calvin looked down the road in the direction of the Santa Fe Trail, which was the most likely route south. "He left, that's what I know. But Rebecca, this means they have a general area. They know you're somewhere in northern New Mexico." She stood on the boardwalk in the October sunshine and felt the familiar geometry of impossible choices assembling itself around her. Run, stay, run, stay. 2 years of running, and she was standing in a town she had been trying to stay in, beside a man she had been trying not to need, and the trap that had always been her life was tightening again. "I should go," she said. "No," Calvin said. She looked at him. "No," he said again, and there was a quiet intensity in it that she had not heard from him before. "Running is what they're counting on. Every town you leave confirms you're someone worth chasing. If you stay, if you have a community around you, if you have standing." "I have no standing," she said. "I'm a woman alone in a territory that has no record of me." "You have a position at Mrs. Pacheco's store," he said. You have the account you gave in that square 3 weeks ago when you saved my life, which 3 dozen people in this town witnessed. You have—" He stopped. He looked at her directly in the way he had that first morning at Delgado's, reading something she had not written but that he seemed to see anyway. "You have me." The boardwalk boards were weathered, and the October air smelled of pinon smoke from a nearby chimney, and a wagon was pulling out from the livery stable down the street with a mechanical dignity. And Rebecca Morgan stood in the middle of all of it and felt the words land in her chest like something she had been waiting a very long time to hear without knowing she was waiting. "Calvin," she said. "I am not saying this to pressure you," he said immediately, carefully. "I am saying it because it is true and because it is relevant to your decision about whether to stay. I am not a young man indulging a passing feeling. I am 34 years old and I know my own mind, and I know that what I feel when I am in your company is not something that has happened to me before." He was not looking away. He had not looked away once. "But the choice is entirely yours, and whatever you decide, I will respect it." She thought about the cabin with her books on the windowsill and her mother's hairbrush on the shelf. She thought about 2 years of gray dresses and temporary rooms and looking away from men who noticed her. She thought about standing in that square with a gun between herself and a strange man's death and feeling, for 60 seconds, like the person she had been born to be. "I'm staying," she said. The relief in his face was like watching a man put down something heavy. They stood on the boardwalk in the afternoon light, and it was not a romantic moment in any of the ways she had read about in novels, but it was true, and she was beginning to believe that true was better. The next morning she wrote a letter. She addressed it to the office of the United States Marshal for the District of New Mexico, located in Santa Fe, and she included in it a careful, organized summary of everything she knew about Franklin Das, his associates, their financial crimes, and the intimidation campaign that had followed her into the territories. She included specific names, specific dates, and specific amounts. She included the names of 3 men who, to her knowledge, were residents of states within federal jurisdiction. She sealed the letter and gave it to Calvin, who sent it by private courier rather than through the Cimarron Postal Service, which reduced the risk of interception. Then she waited. October passed in the amber and gold of a New Mexico autumn. The ranch settled into its seasonal rhythms around her, cattle being moved to winter pastures, fences checked and mended, hay stored against the cold months ahead. Rebecca found herself naturally drawn into the rhythms of the place, helping where she could, learning the names of the horses and the routines of the hands and the particular geography of the Merritt land along the river. Calvin showed her the boundary markers his father had set, walked her along the creek in the evenings when the light was the most beautiful thing she had seen in years, talked to her about everything and nothing, and listened to her with the particular quality of attention that was becoming familiar to her now, and that she suspected she was going to find difficult to live without. They were careful with each other. They were respectful of the distance appropriate to unmarried people living in close proximity on a cattle ranch in territorial New Mexico in 1882. But the care they took with the distance only underscored how present they were to each other, how aware. She knew the sound of his horse before she saw him coming. He noticed when she had not slept well before she said anything. They had conversations that began in the morning and were still continuing in some essential way when they parted for the night. She was in love with him. She identified this as a fact somewhere in the 3rd week of October, during an evening when they were sitting in front of the cabin fireplace with books, and the fire was doing its quiet, efficient work, and Calvin had fallen asleep in his chair with his book open in his lap, and she had looked at him in the firelight. This large, quiet man asleep in a chair like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. And she had thought, with a simple, devastating clarity, "I love this man." She had then thought, "This is very inconvenient." She had then thought, "I do not care." The response from the United States Marshal's office arrived on the 14th of November. The Marshal's name was Everett Colby, and he wrote in a clear, formal hand that he had received her communication and found it to contain information of significant federal interest. He requested a meeting in Santa Fe at her earliest convenience and confirmed that a federal investigation into Franklin Das and several named associates had been underway for some time, and that her testimony could be material to its resolution. He also wrote, and this was the part that caused her to sit down abruptly on the cabin's one proper chair, that Franklin Das had been arrested in Kansas City 3 weeks earlier on charges connected to a separate land fraud case and was currently in federal custody. Several of his primary associates were under investigation and at least 2 had left the country. The organized threat to Rebecca's safety had, in Marshal Colby's assessment, substantially diminished. She read the letter 3 times. Then she walked out of the cabin and across the quarter-mile of brown autumn grass to the main ranch house and knocked on the back door, and when Calvin answered it she said, "I think it might be over," she told him. He read the letter. He set it down carefully on the kitchen table and looked at her across it with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something unguarded and very full. "You're free," he said. "I'm free," she agreed, and it came out as something close to a whisper because the word was too large for normal conversational volume. He came around the table, and she did not step back, and he put his arms around her, and she let herself be held by him in the kitchen of his father's ranch house, with the November afternoon pressing gray against the windows and the smell of wood smoke and cattle and good, honest earth in everything around her. And she pressed her face against his chest and breathed him in and felt the 2 years of cold and running and fear move through her and begin, at last, to let go. Neither of them said anything for a long while. "I would like to go to Santa Fe," she said finally, not moving, "to meet with Marshal Colby to do this properly." "I'll take you," he said. "I know the road." "I know," she said. "You know everything about this territory." She could feel him laugh without hearing it, just the movement of it in his chest. She stepped back and looked at him, and he looked at her, and something was very clearly different between them now, some last protective formality fallen away, and they were both aware of it standing there in his kitchen in the gray November afternoon. "Rebecca," he said. "Calvin," she said. "I have something I want to say to you, and I want to say it before we go to Santa Fe and before anything else happens, because I don't want you to think that what I feel for you has anything to do with gratitude or circumstances or—" "Say it," she said. He looked at her. "I love you. I have been in love with you since approximately the second morning at Delgado's restaurant, and I am aware that may seem hasty for a man of my generally unhurried nature, but there it is." She reached up and touched his face with her palm, the way she had wanted to do for weeks, and felt the warmth of his skin and the slight roughness of his jaw and the particular aliveness of a man who was fully present to the moment. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying very hard not to because I thought I was leaving. I'm not particularly good at not loving things I love once I have started." He turned his face slightly into her hand, the smallest possible motion, full of enormous feeling. "Good," he said. He kissed her then, or she kissed him. It was honestly not entirely clear which of them moved first, and it was not a dramatic kiss, not the kind that novels described with extravagant weather metaphors. It was a careful kiss, the first honest thing between them of that particular kind, tasting of the coffee he had been drinking and carrying in it the accumulated weight of all the weeks of restraint and attention and genuine regard. When they separated, they were both very quiet. "Santa Fe," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "We can be there in 2 days." The ride to Santa Fe was the longest uninterrupted conversation Rebecca had ever had with another person. The road south through the territory was mostly good, the weather cold but clear, the mountain views on either side producing a kind of grandeur that made even silence feel spacious rather than empty. They talked about her childhood in St. Joseph and his in this valley. They talked about law and ranching, and the books they had exchanged, and the history of the territory, and the ways the country was changing with the railroads pushing in from every direction. She told him about her father, about the Missouri courtrooms, about the woman she had been before Franklin Doss. He listened and asked the right questions, the ones that let her find the shape of it rather than the ones that pressed her toward the shape he expected. She felt herself becoming more visible with every mile, not in the dangerous way, in the way of a person emerging from shadow into light, which stings at first and then becomes its own particular pleasure. They stayed at decent hotels on the road south, separate rooms, proper and unremarkable, and arrived in Santa Fe on the third day in the early afternoon. Marshal Colby was a man of perhaps 50 with a methodical manner and an impressive grasp of the case he had built over the past 18 months. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Rebecca laid out her testimony in the organized, detailed form she had prepared, and Marshal Colby's response was the professional acknowledgement of a man receiving exactly the kind of material that converts a solid case into an overwhelming one. "Mrs. Doss," he began at one point, and she interrupted him. "Miss Morgan," she said, "my name is Rebecca Morgan. I intend to keep it." Colby nodded with the equanimity of a man who had heard stranger specifications. "Miss Morgan, your information regarding the Harrington accounts in particular is material we have not been able to obtain through any other channel. Combined with what we already have on the Doss operation, I believe we are looking at a very strong federal prosecution." "Will I need to appear in court?" she asked. "We will require an affidavit at minimum. A personal appearance in court would strengthen the case considerably, but it will not be immediate, and you would testify under federal protection." He paused. "I want to be clear that as of this date, our intelligence indicates that the organized effort to locate you has been substantially disrupted. Franklin Doss's primary financier has fled to Mexico. The man who was sent to Cimarron in October, a man named Deaver, has been detained in Albuquerque on an unrelated charge." He looked at her steadily. "You are not entirely out of danger, but you are considerably less in it than you were 3 months ago." She nodded. Calvin, who had sat quietly through the entire meeting, said, "What would you recommend as precautions in the interim?" Colby looked at him with the thoughtful assessment of a man taking measure. "Staying in a community where she is known and has standing is actually the best protection, making herself harder to target with anonymity and isolation." He looked back at Rebecca. "Don't disappear, Miss Morgan. The irony is that the safer course is to be known." She looked at Calvin. He looked at her. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said. They rode back to Cimarron in 3 days and arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, gray sky pressing low over the mountains, the first real cold of the season in the air, and Cimarron felt entirely different to her than it had when she had arrived in September. It felt like a place she was returning to. It felt like home in the tentative, hopeful, working definition of the word. Mrs. Pacheco greeted her with preserved peaches and the expression of a woman whose predictions had been correct. Torres and the other ranch hands were respectful and warm. The town, in the way of small western towns with long memories and attentive social awareness, had apparently noted the trajectory of things and adjusted its general opinion of Rebecca Morgan from interesting stranger to probable permanent resident, which meant people smiled at her with slightly more warmth and slightly less assessment. She settled back into the cabin, and it felt immediately right. Her books on the windowsill, her mother's hairbrush on the shelf, the fire in the fireplace drawing properly. Calvin came by that evening. They sat in front of the fire, and the conversation was easy and warm, and somewhere in the middle of it he said, quietly, "I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to know before I ask it that I mean it entirely, and that if the answer is no, I will respect that completely." She set her book down. He was looking at the fire rather than at her, which she found endearing because it was the only time she had ever seen him look at something other than what he was addressing. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not because the circumstance requires it or because it would provide protection, or for any reason other than that you are the most fully realized person I have ever known, and the thought of building the rest of my life without you in it seems like a significant waste of a life." He finally looked at her. I know your experience of marriage has not been what it should have been. I know that asking this requires more trust from you than it does from most people. I am asking you to trust me with it." The fire crackled. Outside the cabin window, the November wind was moving through the cottonwoods, and she could hear the particular music of it, the same sound she had heard from her first night in the cabin, and that she had begun to associate with being exactly where she was supposed to be. "Yes," she said. He smiled then, the full smile she had not seen often because he was a man who was generally moderate about demonstrating feeling. But when he smiled fully, it changed his whole face and the room along with it, and she felt it in her chest like warmth spreading from a good fire. "Yes," she said again, because she wanted to say it twice. They were married in Cimarron on the 19th of December, 1882, on a day of bright cold sunshine with snow on the mountains, and a pine bough smell in the air from the decorations Mrs. Pacheco had organized with considerable enthusiasm. The ceremony was performed by the justice of the peace, a dignified man named Armijo who had a formal courtly manner that seemed appropriate to the occasion. Rebecca wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had purchased in Santa Fe, and she had let her hair down for the first time since she had begun running, and she stood in front of the small assembled community of Cimarron, which had come out in numbers that surprised her, and she said the words that made her Rebecca Merritt in the eyes of the territorial court. And when Calvin took her hand, she felt the particular solidity of his grip and the particular warmth of his skin, and she thought, with a completeness that filled every corner of her, that this was what it felt like to choose a life rather than survive one. The ranch house in winter was a different creature than it had been in autumn. The wood stoves worked constantly, and the smell of burning juniper was always present, and the windows ran with condensation in the mornings, and the silence of snowfall on the mesa above them had a quality she had never experienced, absolute and clean, and somehow very old. She moved from the foreman's cabin into the main house and began the process of making it, gradually and thoughtfully, something that was both Calvin's inheritance and her own presence. She brought her books from the cabin windowsill to the main house shelves, which already had a good collection that she spent considerable time exploring. She found his mother's recipe book in a kitchen drawer and began cooking from it, imperfectly at first, and then with growing confidence. She continued her work at Mrs. Pacheco's store 3 days a week, because she needed income of her own, and because the connection to town life was important to her, and because Mrs. Pacheco had become something close to a friend in the way that older women of particular character sometimes become friends with younger women of particular character. January brought the deepest cold, and Calvin taught her the winter rhythms of a cattle ranch, the daily feeding, the breaking of ice on water troughs, the checking of fences against the pressure of snow-loaded cattle huddling into windbreaks. It was hard physical work, and she found she was capable of it and took a quiet pride in that capability. In the evenings they read and talked and played chess, and she discovered that he was a marginally better chess player than she was, but not by as much as he had expected, which produced a satisfaction she was not entirely mature about. She wrote her formal affidavit for Marshal Colby in February, a document of 23 pages that represented the complete and organized record of everything she had witnessed and heard and understood about Franklin Doss's operations. Calvin read it over her shoulder in the evenings as she worked through it, occasionally noting where the legal precision of her language could be strengthened, and she was grateful for his knowledge and slightly amused by his precision. The federal case against Franklin Doss was resolved in the spring of 1883. She received a letter from Marshal Colby on an April morning when the Cimarron River was running high with snowmelt, and the meadows on the south side of the ranch were starting to green. Doss had pleaded guilty to multiple federal fraud charges. He had been sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. The men who had financed his crimes had received lesser sentences in exchange for cooperation with federal prosecutors. The man who had come to Cimarron looking for her in October was serving 18 months. She was, definitively and in the full legal sense, free. She read the letter standing at the kitchen table with the April morning coming through the window and the smell of coffee on the stove and Calvin behind her, reading over her shoulder, his chin near her ear, his hands on her shoulders with a steadiness that she had come to know was simply what he was, steady, and she felt the last locked thing inside her open and release. She was free. She was here. She was home. She turned around and wrapped her arms around him, and he held her against his chest, and she cried, which she had not done in front of him before, which she had not done for herself in a very long time, and he held her through all of it with the particular patience of a man who understood that crying was not weakness but a form of honest accounting. When she was done, she felt emptied out and clean and somehow lighter than she had been in years. "Well," she said, her voice slightly irregular. "Well," he agreed, with the quiet contentment of a man whose world has arranged itself correctly. Spring on the Merritt Ranch was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and she had now been present for every season of it in some form, but spring was specifically overwhelming. The meadows went from brown to green with a speed that seemed almost impatient. The Cimarron River found its voice and kept it. The cottonwoods his father had planted came into their new leaves, and the color of new cottonwood leaves was a particular transparent yellow-green that she did not have words adequate to describe. The horses were restless with the warmer air, and the cattle moved differently, with a looseness that suggested comfort after the cold. Calvin bought her a mare of her own, a chestnut with a calm temperament and an affectionate personality, and she named her Tuesday, because she was purchased on a Tuesday, and also because the name made Calvin smile. She learned to ride the Merritt land properly, not just the trail from cabin to town, but the full extent of it, the river bends and the higher pastures, and the places where her husband had built his life and his father had built a foundation for it. She found the place by the creek bend where the 3 original cottonwoods grew, and she went there sometimes on her own and sat with Tuesday and thought about the things that were worth building and the things that were worth protecting. She was thinking about the future in a way she had not done in years, in specific, concrete, seasonal terms, not just survival but intention. She discovered she was pregnant in June of 1883. She sat with this knowledge for 2 full days before telling Calvin, not from any impulse toward secrecy, but because she wanted to be sure she had understood how she felt about it before she shared it, which was a habit of mind she thought she would always have. The answer, when she fully understood it, was that she felt a joy so large it was slightly frightening, which seemed appropriate. She told him on a Sunday evening after supper. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the warm June air with the stars coming out over the mesa top, which in Cimarron in June were the most comprehensive stars she had ever seen, thick and present and very close. "I am going to have a child," she said. "Our child. In the winter, I think." He looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than most. She could see him absorbing it, the information moving through him in visible stages, surprise and then something deeper, something that went all the way to the foundation of him. He reached out and took her hand and held it and looked at the stars. "A child," he said, and the way he said it, slowly and with tremendous care, as though the word contained more than words usually contained, broke her heart open with love for him. "A child," she confirmed. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, and she felt the warmth of it against the cool evening air, and somewhere in the hills above the river, a coyote sent up its high, wavering call, and the stars were immense overhead, and the world was completely, overwhelmingly right. The baby was born in January of 1884, a boy, delivered by the physician from Cimarron who rode out through the cold with calm efficiency. Labor was long and difficult, and at the worst of it she held Calvin's hand and he held her hand back, and she heard him say things to her very quietly that she would remember for the rest of her life, about courage and strength and the specific beauty of a woman who did not look away from hard things. The child arrived in the deep cold of a January morning with the particular robust announcement of a healthy infant, and Calvin held him with the expression of a man who has been given something he did not know he was capable of receiving. "What shall we call him?" Calvin asked, looking down at the red-faced, indignant bundle in his arms. Rebecca had been thinking about this for several months. "Thomas," she said, "for your father." Calvin looked at her over the head of their son with a depth of feeling that required no elaboration. "Thomas Merritt," he said. Thomas proved to be an energetic and opinionated child from the beginning, which seemed to Rebecca to be the right beginning for a person. He slept in uncertain patterns that required considerable patience, and he had his father's eyes, the deep particular brown of river water in autumn, which Rebecca found she could not look at without experiencing a complicated happiness. The ranch settled into its life around the new person in it. The hands were respectfully delighted. Mrs. Pacheco arrived 3 days after the birth with preserved peaches and strong opinions about infant care, some of which were useful. The Cimarron community registered the birth of Thomas Calvin Merritt with the warm collective pleasure of a small town welcoming its own. Rebecca continued her work at Mrs. Pacheco's store when Thomas was old enough, which occurred sooner than some expected, because she arranged her schedule with the practical resourcefulness of a woman who was not going to give up the parts of herself that were not motherhood simply because motherhood had arrived. Calvin supported this without qualification, which she could have predicted but appreciated enormously nonetheless. The affidavit she had submitted the previous year was used in the federal case in ways that Marshal Colby subsequently confirmed by letter were material to the final outcome. She received a formal letter of commendation from the federal court that she framed and hung in the office she had claimed as her own in a converted room off the main house, the room with the best light, which Calvin had offered her without being asked. The spring of 1885 brought a new challenge to the ranch. The cattle market had been weakening through the previous year, and several of the larger operators in Colfax County were overextended in ways that were beginning to show. Calvin, who was careful and had never expanded beyond what the land and market could sustain, was in a stronger position than most of his neighbors, but the difficulty in the surrounding economy created pressures that required real work and real decisions. They made those decisions together, at the kitchen table in the evenings with the account books between them, and Rebecca found that her understanding of financial mechanisms, built from years of knowing, against her will, the details of Franklin Doss's fraudulent schemes, was actually useful in a legitimate context. She could read a balance sheet with precision, and her understanding of credit and market risk was, in Calvin's assessment, considerably sharper than his own. "You should have been a banker," he said one evening. "I should have been a lawyer," she said. "I still might be eventually." He looked at her with the complete seriousness he always brought to her ambitions. "The territory will have formal statehood one day. The laws will change." "They are already changing," she said. "Women are practicing law in some jurisdictions. Then you will practice law in this one, eventually, when you are ready." He said it as though it were simply a matter of timing, as though there were no question of the outcome. She loved him for that, the specific kind of love that comes from being seen clearly and believed inconsequently. Thomas was 18 months old in the summer of 1885, and was at that age operating at a pace that required constant surveillance and considerable athleticism from everyone around him. He had a particular affinity for the horses, which was both appropriate given his parentage and alarming given his size relative to theirs. Calvin began taking him to the stable with deliberate regularity, showing him the right way to approach a horse, the proper protocols, building the foundation of a relationship with animals that was both safe and respectful. Rebecca watched this and felt the particular sharp joy of witnessing a father be good. She discovered the second pregnancy in August of 1885. Thomas was 17 months old and she was 37, and she felt a brief, reasonable concern about the timing and the age, and then resolved that she had spent enough of her life being afraid of things to be afraid of this joy, which was in any case already present and needed no permission. She told Calvin at breakfast directly, which was how she told him everything. He set down his coffee cup. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he asked, not an expression of opinion about the timing or the circumstance, but a direct inquiry about her. "I am very well," she said. "Good." He picked up his coffee cup. "Then everything else is good." She laughed at this, genuinely and fully, the laugh of a woman who is home. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1886, on a morning of the exact quality of spring light that Rebecca had come to associate with new possibilities, the transparent yellow-green light of new cottonwood leaves. They named her Anne, for Rebecca's mother. Anne turned out to have her mother's eyes and her father's temperament, which proved to be a combination of outstanding practical utility. She was a calm, attentive child who watched the world around her with a focused interest that made people feel, even at 6 months, as though she was taking notes. Thomas, for his part, accepted the new arrival with the complicated pragmatism of an older sibling, who has determined that the situation is permanent and might as well be adapted to. He was periodically bossier than the situation warranted and genuinely tender when he forgot to perform the bossiness, and both states were so completely his father's son that it was sometimes difficult for Rebecca to look at him directly. The years moved. The ranch found its full rhythm. The cattle market recovered in 1887, and the Merritt operation, which had been careful through the lean years, expanded modestly and wisely along the river, adding a small horse breeding operation that Calvin had always wanted, and that proved to have an enthusiastic market. The horses Calvin and his hands bred had a quality of temperament that became known in the region, steady and willing animals that people paid fair prices for. Rebecca's work at Mrs. Pacheco's store evolved as she did. When Mrs. Pacheco's health began declining in 1888, Rebecca increasingly managed the business, and when Mrs. Pacheco died quietly in the winter of 1889, she left the store to Rebecca in a will that the old woman had made with characteristic organization and directness. Rebecca carried on the business in Mrs. Pacheco's name, making small changes over time while preserving the essential character of a place that the community depended on. She also began, in the early 1890s, to pursue the legal education she had wanted since she was a girl reading her father's books in Missouri. The territory's laws were changing with the pressure of incoming statehood, which would not arrive until 1912, but whose approach was already reshaping legal practice and professional standards. She corresponded with attorneys in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. She read voraciously. She sat in on court sessions in Cimarron and later traveled to Santa Fe twice a year to observe and study. Calvin drove her to the Cimarron stage on the mornings of these trips, and when she returned, he met the stage with the horses and they rode home in the late afternoon light, and she told him everything she had seen and learned, and he listened with the interested attention of a man who was genuinely glad his wife was becoming the person she had always been meant to be. Thomas, at 7, told a playmate definitively that his mother was going to be a lawyer, and his mother was going to be the best lawyer in New Mexico. The playmate, whose own mother was focused on domestic concerns, was uncertain what to make of this. Thomas seemed to find this uncertainty uninteresting and moved on to other topics. The letter arrived in the autumn of 1891. It was from the federal court, and it informed Rebecca Morgan Merritt that her testimony and documentation had been cited in 3 additional federal fraud prosecutions arising from the Doss case, and that the court wished to acknowledge her material contribution to these outcomes. It was signed by a federal judge in Kansas City and had a particular official weight to it. She read it at the kitchen table while Thomas practiced his letters at the other end, and Anne arranged and rearranged her small collection of carved wooden animals with the methodical pleasure of a 4-year-old, engaged in important work. Calvin came in from the morning's work, and she handed him the letter, and he read it and set it down and looked at her across the table, and the look between them contained years. All of them. From a dusty September square in 1882 to this kitchen in 1891, with the children and the smell of coffee, and the autumn light coming through the window onto the law books on the shelf that were hers. "The woman I met on that boardwalk in Cimarron," he said, "was trying very hard not to be found." "She was," Rebecca said, "and yet here she is." "Here I am," she agreed. He came around the table and stood behind her chair and put both hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and covered his left hand with her own, her thumb tracing the familiar territory of his knuckles. Outside, the cottonwoods along the creek were doing what his father's trees had done every autumn for 32 years, going gold and brilliant and entirely unapologetic about the beauty of it. Thomas looked up from his letters. "What does the letter say?" "It says your mother is very important," Calvin told him. Thomas considered this with the equanimity of a child for whom this was simply a confirmed fact. "I know that," he said, and went back to his letters. Anne looked up from her wooden animals long enough to confirm that no emergency had occurred, then returned to her arrangements. Rebecca laughed, and the laugh filled the kitchen and went out through the open window into the autumn air and dispersed into the wide, indifferent, beautiful New Mexico sky, and she held her husband's hand on her shoulder and was still and was seen and was home. She had tried to be invisible. She had been very good at it. She had worn gray and said nothing, and looked away from men who noticed her and left towns before they could remember her face, and she had survived. But surviving had not been living. Living had required being seen by one specific pair of autumn brown eyes in one specific dusty September square, and having that man knock on her door with his hat in his hands and say simply, "Thank you," and mean everything else beneath it that she had been afraid to hear. She had stopped running when she could not let an innocent man die. She had stayed when she could not leave behind the first person who had ever asked her what she needed to feel safe. She had built something real in the years since then, a marriage that was a genuine partnership, children who were growing up watching their parents treat each other with respect and honesty and love, a business that served a community, a legal education that was becoming something she had not quite finished dreaming into its final shape. The men who had hunted her were in federal prisons or in other countries or simply gone, scattered by the inevitable entropy of enterprises built on fraud and fear. Franklin Doss would be released from prison in 1895, a diminished man with no organization behind him and no particular power over anything. She expected she would feel something when that day came, some residual fear or anger, and she was prepared to feel it and to let it pass through her and be gone. She had practiced now at that particular form of release. She was 33 years old in 1891, and she had the ranch and the store and the legal practice she was building slowly toward, and 2 children, and a husband who was the best person she had ever known. And the cottonwood trees outside were going gold in the October light the way they had always done and would always do, marking the seasons in the particular faithful way of things that had put down real roots into real ground. She was not invisible. She was precisely, completely, and gratefully herself. And that, at the end of all the running and all the fear and all the long gray years of self-erasure, was the thing that she had always been trying to find her way back to. Thomas finished his letters and announced that he was going to look at the horses. Calvin told him to stay on the near side of the fence. Thomas agreed with the transparent sincerity of a 7-year-old, who fully intended to determine for himself which side of the fence was technically the near one. Anne finished her arrangements and began them again from a different conceptual starting point. The afternoon light moved through the window and lay across the law books and the federal letter, and the family at the kitchen table in the ranch house that Thomas Calvin Merritt the elder had built in 1859 on good land near good water in the valley below the Cimarron Range. The house, that a woman named Rebecca Morgan had arrived at running and had stayed in choosing. The house that was full now of the specific ordinary, extraordinary life that two people had built together from a gun pressed against one man's chest and a woman's refusal to remain invisible one moment longer. The cottonwood trees went gold, the river ran, the mountains stood. And Rebecca Merritt set the federal letter on the stack with her law books and poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her husband and drank the other herself in the warmth of the afternoon light of everything she had chosen to be.